Buenos días a todos. Para comenzar, quiero saludar a todos los empresarios aquí presentes en su día.
Good morning, everyone. To begin, I want to greet all the business people present here today and thank them for having invested and continuing to invest in the country. Production in a country with so many chronic problems, like ours, is, without a doubt, a task worthy of recognition. I also want to thank the President of the Argentine Industrial Union, Drive, Daniel Funes de Rioja, for inviting me to speak before all of you on this important day. I want to take this opportunity to debunk two great myths that, for decades, were used by politicians to reach deep into the industrial sector and enrich themselves at the expense of all those who produce. These myths, to the detriment of all Argentines, were so successful that they became dogmas in public debate. The first is the one that accuses simultaneous industrial development of being incompatible with that of the primary sectors of the economy. As I've said before, for 100 years, politics sold us the narrative that, to have a thriving economy, industrial development had to be achieved by trampling on dynamic and export-oriented sectors, especially the countryside. But this wasn't always the case, and I can see the proof, because the period of greatest industrial expansion in Argentine history was precisely during the agro-export model, and not, as some claim, during the failed state-sponsored import substitution model. It was economic development, generated by the private sector, that was the origin of our first industrialization. The same thing happened in the 1930s when the Argentine market naturally developed to meet the demand that a devastated and undercapitalized Europe couldn't meet after the crash of 1929. But at some point, around the middle of the last century, politics decided that for the country to develop, everything had to be produced here, and it began to arbitrate, with an iron fist, the relationship between the different sectors of the economy, robbing one sector to give others social justice. Industry was subordinated to the overprotection of the state, in the form of credit, subsidies, tax exemptions, customs barriers, and tariffs of all kinds, to compete in the local market. They said it was to industrialize the country. That industrial sectors had to be helped to compete with imported manufacturers. They promised that, over time, they would achieve genuine competition on equal terms, and that thus there would be more and better jobs. But paradoxically, they became increasingly dependent on the state, which, in turn, depended on agricultural exports to finance all those benefits. This created a vicious relationship of tutelage with the state, which we endure to this day. The consequence is that, to protect industry, the countryside was robbed, and this protection only generated an industrial sector addicted to the state. This is one of the roots of the structural economic crises we have suffered for so many decades. 100 years of insisting on these ideas ended, firstly, ruining our export potential, punishing the countryside with obstacles and taxes and directly impeding the development of other export sectors, such as the copper industry, in which we should be global players. Secondly, they harmed all Argentines because they forced us to pay more for lower quality products, increasing the cost of living and reducing everyone's savings capacity and, consequently, their investment capacity. And finally, despite all the talk about industrial policy, they ended up directly harming a large part of the industry itself. Because, behind all those supposed good intentions that justified alchemy and experiments, which resulted in 113 years of fiscal deficits, out of the last 123, they restricted the free purchase and sale of foreign currency, crushed the exchange rate, imposed tariffs, and destroyed the relative prices of the economy. And in having been, along with the Maduro dictatorship, the only countries in the region with more than 20 points of year-on-year inflation for the last 15 consecutive years. Who can win in a country like this? No one. And the results are clear. Argentina has practically the same amount of formal private employment as it did 15 years ago. Ultimately, no sector can do well if society as a whole does poorly, except perhaps for the political class. What's worse, so much misery ended up imposing a different business model on many sectors. Since it was no longer about thinking about how to produce more, better, and more cheaply, but rather about figuring out how to access the greatest number of advantages and perks possible from the state in order to survive. What I'm trying to say with all this is that supposed sectoral development policies, at the cost of a shattered macroeconomic system, are doomed to fail, and worse, are doomed to further exacerbate the underlying problem. This point is crucial for both you, who are in the trenches, and the economic analysts who make a living by offering opinions or demanding a development plan. Everything we Argentines are used to hearing about economic matters is simply a scam, which only benefits a few, to the detriment of all. I strongly recommend a commentary making the rounds by the brilliant Claudio Zuchevitsky on The Man Who Calculated. Don't miss it because it will shed a lot of light on the scam the politicians have peddled. Taking from some to give to others is not an economic policy, it's theft that, moreover, destroys the economy in the long run. So, know that when someone talks to you about boosting industry, while issuing money, by 13 points of GDP in 1 year, while crushing the exchange rate up to a third of its market value, while authorizing imports, even though there are no dollars, that person is not pro-industry. That person is a swindler, period. I'll tell you. Do you know what the best industrial policy is? Have a good fiscal and monetary policy. Honor the debts and restore the country's credibility so that, from the outside, they trust that if they sell to us, we will pay them. Do you know what the best industrial policy is? End inflation, restore economic calculation, and return the gifts of stability to Argentines. We must return the future to ordinary Argentines, the ability to look ahead and plan, save, and be masters of their own economic decisions. That is the best industrial policy. Think about what you prefer your buyers to be like. Families with savings capacity, who are getting ahead and can increasingly buy more and better products, or impoverished families who have to advance their consumption by buying whatever they find first, in 24 installments, because stockpiling goods is more profitable than saving in currency? Only if society as a whole is doing well can industry do well, sustainably. Besides, you know that, for those who run a business, stability means freedom. Or isn't the constant accounting of a regime of high and unstable inflation a prison? It's a hellish waste of energy, that energy you spend today overcoming the obstacle of instability. Tomorrow you can invest in thinking about how to sell a better product at a better price. If the value of a company is measured according to the present value of that company's future cash flows, stability is a sine qua non for your company to be worth something. There is no value without stability. There is no profit without stability. There is no growth without stability. I told you I wanted to debunk two myths. The second is the worst of all and is adjacent to the previous myth. The myth that economic freedom is harmful to industrial development. No country has gone bankrupt by opening up to international trade. All those that did have actually progressed. Who could possibly come up with such nonsense? And the only thing harmful to industrial development is having an elephantine state riding on its back. This administration is determined to reduce Argentina's cost across the entire national economic life in order to improve the competitiveness of all productive sectors. We came here to shrink the state to fatten your pockets. Since we're talking about myths, Argentina's cost is like a mythological monster with many heads. The first of these is the financial cost. That is, the ability of economic actors to access cheap credit. Do you know what the main factor influencing the financial cost is? The country risk, which was around 2,400 points on the day of the runoff, and, today, is around 1,400 points, thanks to the tremendous work being done by Toto, Caputo, Santiago Basili, the giant Pablo Cuerno, and his entire team. Incidentally, last Friday they launched their own online channel where they comment on the country's economic path and its objectives. In case anyone is interested in going to the sources and stopping relying on information fabricated by overzealous journalists. In that same country, risk that rises every time the degenerate prosecutors in Congress pass unaffordable laws without saying where they want to get the money from. The first thing we did upon taking office, and against the advice of the eco-chantas, was to arbitrage local interest rates with the international interest rate, adjusted for risk. This obviously implied, given the devaluation jump, a negative real interest rate in pesos, and which, in turn, allowed for the liquefaction and dismantling of interest-bearing liabilities. Incidentally, this is in addition to the fiscal feat we accomplished, because we inherited a 15-point consolidated fiscal deficit between the Treasury and the central bank. They told us that making a 1-point GDP adjustment in the Treasury was impossible. When we said we were going to achieve a zero deficit in the first year, they told us it was impossible. And that group of giants in the Ministry of Economy achieved it in a month. They certainly have merit, but since that wasn't enough, and there were 10 more issues to resolve at the central bank, an issue that no one was talking about and that also seemed impossible to resolve, we resolved it in 7 months. That is to say, in 113 years, of the last 123, we always had a deficit. The 10 years we had a surplus were because we were in default. What no one had achieved in 123 years, which is a robust and real fiscal surplus, we achieved in the first month, and something that had no semblance of a solution, which was the problem of interest-bearing liabilities, in which everyone believed would end in expropriation or hyperinflation. We resolved it in the market in 7 months. Now that's some serious management. Naturally, this meant that banks had to go back to working as banks and lending capital to people and businesses, instead of placing their capital in the central bank, further inflating the issuance of currency to collect interest. Thus, loans of all kinds, including mortgages, returned, generating an unprecedented boom in the real estate sector. A year ago, the thought of borrowing capital for 30 years seemed crazy, and today, in the new Argentina, it's a reality. I mean, when we started the government, we talked about hyperinflation. Today, we talk about 30-year mortgages and the return on loans. It seems unbelievable how much we've done in such a short time. The second head of this monster, which is the Argentine cost, is labor costs. No company in the world can compete with these labor costs. Labor costs that arise from outdated regulations that supposedly aim to protect workers, but all they do is destroy jobs. Let's see if this is understood once and for all. There is only one sustainable way for workers to be better off every day, a state that protects the value of their money and a thriving sector that demands work. No matter how many regulations they invent to protect workers, any regulation that undermines the value of the currency and the private sector's ability to generate wealth only creates more poverty. We must understand this once and for all. Labor laws in Argentina are for workers what the failed rental law is for tenants. I still remember all the criticism they leveled at us when we deregulated the rental market, but no one, among all those eco-conspirators, ever talks about how the supply of properties on offer exploded and how, in relative terms, rental prices ended up plummeting. Could it be that they have trouble assimilating, understanding, or accepting how powerful the market is? The third head of the monster is somewhat misleading, as it is difficult to quantify because it is the invisible cost of the state, bureaucracy. Or, to put it another way, the cost of the impediment machine, the opportunity cost of stopping work to waste time in an office and pay senseless fees. having to walk through the halls of public administration asking for stamps upon stamps in order to be able to produce. Taxes are a clear demonstration of this phenomenon. In Argentina, we have nearly 190 taxes, 10 of which collect more than 90% of total revenue. That is, there are nearly 180 taxes that don't even collect 10% of revenue. These taxes cause us direct economic harm. Their effect is almost marginal. However, they create obstacles, delays, paperwork, and an endless number of procedures that hinder economic activity in a country where making money is already an impossible task. Not to mention the kiosks this entails. That's why the task being carried out by the Colossus Federico Sturzenegger, dismantling all types of regulations, is so important. From the very beginning, we've been deregulating what we can, knowing that the road ahead is littered with potholes and obstacles. Without going any further, last week we announced the elimination of bureaucratic obstacles for the import of steel, aluminum, and construction materials. And we have eliminated bureaucracy related to the plastics and synthetic yarn industries. We are simplifying export procedures, such as the temporary admission regime and the repurchase agreement. In addition, we are eliminating all discretionary import controls, including the SIRA system, which was a mechanism exploited by the previous administration to collect bribes from importers. In the new Argentina, no one has to kowtow to any bureaucrat to import something, and we are doing all of this in order to continue improving the competitiveness of our economy. Because those who produce must focus on producing and thus maximize their time, so they can then use the fruits of their labor as they see fit. The fourth head, the most grotesque of all, because it represents the direct cost, taxes, that is, the state's impact on the price of goods and services. This morning, we lowered the infamous tax on the country by 10 points. A tax created by Kirchnerism under the pretext that it would be temporary, yet they tired of systematically extending it. It's interesting because many times in Argentina, taxes have been created. It's been said they were temporary, and then they were never lowered. Welcome to the historic moment when an administration said it was creating it temporarily. And today it's becoming a reality that this reduction was made. It's the first time in history, and not only that, but, in December, the infamous tax on the country will end. There's a quote by Milton Friedman that said there was nothing more permanent than a temporary increase in public spending. And in reality, since you have to finance this, and this is interesting, I'm going to quote an economist I don't like, and I don't agree with everything he says, but this quote is interesting. What Keynes said is that all public spending is always paid for. That is, either you're going to pay for it with monetary issuance, generating inflation and an inflationary tax, or you're going to pay for it with debt, which are future taxes, that is, defrauding future generations, our children, our grandchildren, and so on, or you pay for it with explicit taxes, but it's always paid for. Therefore, given Friedman's quote, there's nothing more permanent than a temporary tax, unless it's a liberal government that says it's going to lower taxes and, indeed, does. In other words, with us, that's over. Just as we lowered it by 10% this morning, in December we're going to eliminate it completely, thus driving down the prices of imported products. It's worth noting that imported products include countless production inputs, meaning this measure helps lower operating costs, improving the competitiveness of our industry. Did the geniuses of import substitution never realize that 80% of imports are production inputs, and that inflating their prices by force is only detrimental to the Argentine population? We must put an end to the bureaucrats' creativity, because all they achieve is turning Argentina into a tax hell and a proliferation of kiosks. Just as we lowered the country tax, we already eliminated withholding taxes on more than 5 categories of meat. We also eliminated export duties for the automotive industry and lowered the tax on automobile transfers. We reduced import tariffs on basic necessities for various productive sectors, and we're just getting started. Imagine what we're capable of if we improve our competitiveness. The list of jobs, kiosks and bureaucracies that complicated and continue to complicate the lives of Argentines is endless. Among them is the fifth head of the monster we came to combat: the cost borne by all Argentines to protect the businesses of the friends of those in power. A clear example is the case of Starlink, whose entry we allowed as soon as we took office. Improving connectivity throughout the rural nation at zero cost, or the case of the foot and mouth disease vaccine, whose import we authorized a few weeks ago, guaranteeing greater competitiveness and reduced costs in meat production. But, like the Hydra of Greek mythology, when you cut off one head of this monster, another appears. The sixth head of the monster would be what we call the cost of forced representation, that is, the state imposing a representation on you to which you must pay tribute, like, for example, SADAIC, whose jobs we cut last week, or the unions that drive around in luxury cars with chauffeurs at the expense of their constituents being unable to even pay the bus fare. Or the poverty managers, those who administered social benefits for the most vulnerable, and forced them to march for their own interests, under the threat of cutting off their plans. I could spend the rest of the week listing things that remain to be corrected, but I want to focus on the most important cost of all, the main head of this mythological monster we came to destroy: the fiscal deficit, that is, the great hidden tax. Why a hidden tax? Because if the deficit is paid with monetary issuance, it ends up being paid with an inflationary tax. While if the deficit is financed with debt, it ends up being paid with future taxes, in other words, a burden on future generations. If there's one thing we've made clear and will never tire of repeating, it's that we came here to lower taxes, not raise them, and that the fiscal surplus for this administration is non-negotiable. That's the pact I made with the Argentine people and among ourselves when they elected us in the last elections, and that's what we came here to fulfill. In other words, we're going to lower taxes. We're not going to negotiate the fiscal result. The subtitle is, we're going to continue reducing public spending. And what seemed impossible, public spending in the national treasury, in real terms, so far this year, has fallen 30%. In other words, to find cuts and adjustments, like what Argentina has done, can only be observed after World War II, and even so, our adjustment remains the largest in history. We still have much work ahead of us, knowing that every step, no matter how small, represents a weight lifted from the private sector. I would like to emphasize that none of this would be possible without the titanic work being done by the teams at the Ministry of Economy and the Ministry of Deregulation, who, like Hercules, accepted the heroic feat of exterminating this many-headed monster, this empowered Leviathan, which has been the cause of all our hardships as Argentines. The only difference is that, instead of a sword, I have given them a chainsaw. Little by little, all these efforts, both in terms of correcting the macroeconomic situation and in terms of structural reforms, are translating into tangible improvements in economic activity. Last July, for example, was a record month for car sales, the highest sales recorded since 1995. In the energy sector, we have already reversed 13 years of deficits, with very encouraging projections for the coming years. The first 6 months of this year marked the highest half-year trade surplus in the country's history, and in July, exports grew almost 20% compared to the previous year. If you want a clear example of what happens when Argentine costs are reduced and freedom is increased, look at the large investor incentive regime, RIGI, which was regulated a few weeks ago. Despite only having 37 representatives and 7 senators, and we already expect investments of more than $50 billion. On top of that, we improved payments to importers and are currently paying 90% of imports, compared to the 15% that was due in November 2023. In other words, in 8 months we solved a record trade debt problem. Unprecedented in the world. We could even say we saved the sector, and even today, with so many positive announcements, we still have to hear some degenerate prosecutors talk about industry side. All of this is nothing more and nothing less than the skeleton of the most ambitious economic reform in democratic history, and its most incipient consequences. But I assure you, there is still much more to come. Remember that the largest structural reform in history was the one Menem implemented in the early 1990s. The one we passed with the RIGI, plus the DNU, is 8 times larger than the one Menem implemented, and we did that with 15% of the Chamber of Deputies, with 10% of the Senate. Come and tell me if that isn't political management. What a while, Francos. I want to pause, especially, to acknowledge and thank those present here for the generosity and good faith they have shown in our national project. They have been patient, enduring these 9 months of government, which I know have been arduous, and they have been brave in supporting, along with the rest of the business chambers, when we celebrated the May Pact in Tucumán. Because they chose to support a profoundly liberal program, and the principles they subscribe to indicate a profound change of course. It also implies leaving behind harmful economic ideas and regulatory architectures, but deeply rooted in the Argentine productive and commercial fabric. And at this point, I think there should be few people who doubt, for better or worse, that what we say, we do. Ultimately, this great feat, which we call the war against the Argentine cost, will necessarily entail a transformation in the industrial sector. And great transformations often generate uncertainty and even fear, but we mustn't be afraid of change. Because 100 years of collectivism have taught us one thing, that we Argentines have the ability to extract water from stones and undertake, even in the worst of conditions. Or do you think it's a coincidence that, despite being the country in the region with the lowest foreign investment over the last 15 years, we are also the one with the most unicorns per capita? If you can persevere under adverse conditions, with exorbitant taxes, absurd regulations, and sky-high costs, imagine what you can do without the state's boot on your neck. I tell you, dare to innovate and compete, because there is no force of nature greater than an Argentinian wanting to make money. And with the increase in competitiveness that the profound reforms we are undertaking will bring, there will be a genuine industrial boom that we cannot even imagine yet. Does this mean everyone will win? No, because that would be a lie. In fact, Schumpeter spoke of creative destruction. So, when these processes appear, some progress, others adapt. And it's true that some also fall by the wayside, but the system provides the possibilities for reconversion, whether to seek revenge or join elsewhere. Here we have to be honest. We are few in number, and we know each other well. Many have enjoyed for too long the blessing that the Argentine people as a whole gave them in the form of subsidies, exemptions, and tariffs on competition. They've had decades of hunting in the zoo, protected by the ruse of preparing their productive matrix and business model to be able to compete within their own laws. Guys, if that wasn't enough, how much more can be demanded of the Argentine people as a whole, who, at the end of the day, are the ones who pay with the sweat of their brow for these privileges. Change, for many, will entail, as President Menem said, learning to ride a bicycle without training wheels. The majority will surely find a balance, precisely because the reduction in Argentine costs will offset the elimination of benefits that were harmful to society as a whole. Reality itself will separate the wheat from the chaff, or, in other words, those who aren't there or those who don't need the work to sell will do well. For our part, you have a commitment that we will do everything possible to ensure that the transition from the model of decadence to the model of freedom leaves neither companies nor workers out in the cold. We will not leave them stranded. We will open the economy when the structural conditions are right, so that competitive companies are as competitive as possible. As I always say, our economic program has stages, which are assigned by the achievement of objectives, and we will not rush any decision unless the conditions for that measure to be successful are first met. Finally, know that in me you will find an ally from the private sector. It is you, along with your efforts, who push forward, generate wealth and jobs. The state generates neither wealth nor jobs. When the state generates wealth, it does so for politicians. When the state creates jobs, it does so for its friends. The only ones who generate wealth and jobs are business owners, investing their capital to make a profit, and when they make a profit, it is because they are improving people's lives. When a businessman makes money, he's a social benefactor because he's solving people's problems, and the more money they make, the better, because it means they're truly social benefactors. What we can do, and what we're already doing, is remove all the obstacles that stand in the way, with the vision of making Argentina the freest country in the world, because Argentina, Argentines, and their companies have everything they need to compete on equal terms with the best. We know how to do it, and I have no doubt we'll achieve it. So, may God bless the Argentines and may the forces of heaven be with them. Long live freedom, damn it. Thank you very much.